being eaten by a whale, plagues of locusts ravaging your crops, worms eating your insides. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're risking eternal damnation and looking at the top 15 of God's most brutal punishments. Number 15. Miriams Disease. Let's start with the OG of the Bible, the Old Testament, which shows us that God has a sense of irony. Moses, the leader of the Israelites, married a Cushite woman, someone of African descent. Not everyone was happy with his choice of partner. Miriam and Aaron, Moses' sister and brother-in-law, criticized Moses for his choice of wife and questioned his leadership. Families, huh? So God enveloped Miriam's tent with an ominous cloud. When it cleared, Miriam had been struck down with leprosy. Her skin had become as white as snow, and if left untreated, leprosy can cause nerve damage, permanent numbness, and physical deformities. Being a kind brother, Moses immediately prayed to God for her healing. And being a benevolent guy, God healed Miriam. But she had to spend 7 days in isolation outside of the camp until she was clean again. Occasionally, God's punishments were as weird as they were brutal. And next on our list is a great example of that. Number 14. Jonah eaten by a whale. God commanded a prophet named Jonah to travel to the city of Nineveh and preach repentance to its inhabitants. However, Jonah wasn't too keen and tried to escape by boarding a boat headed in the opposite direction. While at sea, a massive storm formed and violently tossed the boat around. Naturally, the sailors blamed the new guy Jonah, saying that everything was fine until he came aboard. Taking one for the team, Jonah told them to throw him overboard. As soon as the sailors threw him into the sea, the water calmed, so it actually was his fault. But in true biblical fashion, things only got worse. A huge whale emerged from the deep and swallowed Jonah whole. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah was trapped in the wet, stinking belly of the whale, forced to endure its bodily functions. Finally, Jonah asked God for forgiveness, and the whale vomited him up. Afterwards, Jonah reluctantly set out to complete his mission. As gross as being stuck in the belly of a whale sounds, we're just getting started, and things are about to get deadly. Number 13. Venomous snakes. The tribes of Israel were traveling through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land, but the journey was long, and with no Ubers, they showed a lack of faith and complained. In response, an angry God unleashed venomous serpents into the camp, resulting in the deaths of many in the tribes. Moses prayed to God on behalf of the Israelites. God relented, but he didn't remove the serpents. Instead, he instructed Moses to make a bronze snake and affix it to a pole in the center of the camp. Anyone bitten by the snake could look at the bronze serpent and be cured, preventing a nasty, agonizing death by venom. However, the snakes continued to roam the camp and deliver painful bites as a reminder of God's wrath. Number 12. Nebuchadnezzar's insanity. Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar was notorious for his ruthless war-making. He liked nothing better than laying siege to cities, looting treasures from the temples, and carrying thousands of people into exile in Babylon. One day, Nebuchadnezzar was walking around on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, admiring the magnificent city he had built. He bragged that his achievements were all created by him, with his mighty power and majesty. This was the final straw. As the words left his mouth, a mysterious voice from heaven declared that Nebuchadnezzar's royal authority would be removed. He would be driven away from people and live among the wild animals for 7 years, eating grass until he acknowledged God's sovereignty. As prophesied, Nebuchadnezzar lost his sanity and was driven out to live in the wilderness. Exposed to the elements, he spent long, cold nights sleeping among the oxen and eating grass. His hair grew long and matted, and his nails became like the claws of a bird. After 7 long years, his sanity was restored when he finally praised God. The moral of the story is always give God some props. And don't lie to him, just like this next punishment. Number 11. Ananias and Safia steal from God. In the fledgling days of the church, followers of Jesus agreed to sell their belongings to support those in need. Apart from Ananias and his wife, Safia, these two biblical schemers decided to keep back a portion of their money that they made from selling their land. When the time came to hand over the money, Ananias went to the assembly and laid the money at the apostles' feet, claiming it was the full amount. Peter wasn't convinced, accusing him of lying to the Holy Spirit. Upon hearing Peter's words, Ananias fell down dead. A few hours later, Safia arrived looking for her husband. When questioned about the amount received from selling the land, she lied, giving the same amount as Ananias. You guessed it, she was instantly struck down. Number 10. King Herod Agrippa, eaten by worms. Over and over again in the Bible, God punished hubris, and this entry is no exception. One day, King Herod Agrippa appeared before a crowd in dazzling silver finery to give a public speech. Some crowd members enthusiastically declared that Herod was a god, not a man. Instead of correcting this blasphemy, Herod just decided to roll with it and basked in the adulation. An angel of the Lord confronted Herod and struck him down, but this was no ordinary smiting. He was afflicted with worms that consumed him from the inside out. It was a slow, agonizing death. Herod would have been aware of the worms devouring his flesh, but powerless to stop them. He was really worm food. Number 9. The Greed of Aan. Aan was an Israelite soldier who fought in the Battle of Jericho under Joshua. Unlike typical victories, God had commanded the Israelites to take no spoils of war from Jericho, as everything was accursed. However, Aan couldn't resist, stealing a beautiful robe along with some gold and silver. His sin was discovered, and God commanded that Aan, his family, and all his possessions be destroyed. Aan, his loved ones, and their livestock were stoned to death. This meant that an assembled group of executors used the family as target practice, throwing stones at them until they died from blunt force trauma. Reportedly, stonings can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours before the victim dies. After the deaths of Aan and his family, Joshua had their bodies burned and, in a final humiliation, covered with a pile of stones. The punishments are only going to get more intense from here, and you won't want to miss what's coming up next. Number 8. Treat the Ark of the Covenant with respect, or else. The Ark of the Covenant famously melted a Nazi's face in a certain adventure movie. While that might have been fiction, the actual Bible shows that God took his holy relics very seriously. The Philistines staged the ultimate heist and stole the Ark of the Covenant. They had played hot potato with the Ark, passing it from city to city, and everywhere it went, it caused problems. It repeatedly toppled the statue of a Philistine god, unleashed a plague of mice, caused tumors, and even death in another city. Simply being near it made the Philistine public feel deeply uneasy. After 7 months of bad luck and a whole lot of thieves' remorse, the Philistine rulers decided to return the Ark with a guilt offering: golden figurines of tumors representing each afflicted city, and 5 golden mice representing the 5 Philistine rulers. They hoped that the God of Israel would be appeased and end their suffering. The Philistines loaded the Ark onto a cart pulled by oxen and sent it into Israeli territory. There was much rejoicing over the return of God's holy artifact, and the Israelites prepared a burnt offering. However, 70 curious men decided to sneak a peek inside the Ark, violating God's safe space, and they were immediately struck dead. Number 7. Don't tease the prophets of God. The prophet Elisha was walking along a road on his way to preach to the wicked city of Bethel when he was confronted by a crowd of youths. They taunted him, calling the follically challenged Elisha baldy, and mockingly told him to go up to heaven. Rather than confronting those hooligans, Elisha called for backup, summoning a curse in the name of the Lord. 2 female bears charged out of the woods, quickly attacking the youths with their long claws and sharp teeth. 42 boys were mauled to death, and no one called Elisha baldy again. Number 6. Koras Rebellion. Often God's punishments were especially harsh when leaders led other people astray. For 40 years, the tribes of Israel were in the midst of wandering through the wilderness due to their complaints. No one likes a complainer. Wealth merchant Korah, as well as Dathan and Abiram, conspired with 250 chiefs of the people to rebel against Moses and Aaron's authority. They also claimed that the camp of Israel should be led collectively by all the people. Many Israelites sided with the rebels, and they wanted Moses and Aaron removed from power. Moses told them to show up the next morning with vessels of incense, and God would make his selection for who should lead Israel, like some sort of biblical draft. The next morning, the rebels and the chiefs, along with Moses and Aaron, assembled at the tabernacle in front of the Israeli people. The 250 chiefs offered incense to God using their incense burners. Heavenly fire from the incense pans blazed up and consumed all 250 of the chiefs. Moses pleaded with God not to destroy all the people on account of Korah. God wanted the Israelites to stand back from the rebels. As the earth shook and the ground opened up underneath not only Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and also under their tents and their families, they and their possessions were swallowed whole. The next day, a bunch of people hadn't learned their lesson, and they complained about the treatment of the rebels, so God sent a plague into the camp. The plague killed 14,700 people before Aaron was able to appease God's wrath by burning incense and making atonement for the people. The next punishment takes us to cities where the parties were so crazy, they'd put even the wildest nights in Vegas to shame. Number 5. Sodom and Gomorrah. The towns of Sodom and Gomorrah had a reputation for being wicked, dangerous places, best avoided by travelers. A local man named Lot, however, graciously welcomed some travelers into his home for the night. The men of the towns came banging on Lot's door, demanding that he send the men out to them for inappropriate acts. Let's just say they wanted to get to know them better. Lot refused and offered to send out his daughters instead. That was nice of him, but the crowd rejected the offer, only wanting the travelers. But in a twist to rival any Hollywood movie, the travelers were actually angels in disguise. As Lot was a righteous man, the angels warned him that he and his family should flee to the mountains without looking back. They were going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters fled the city while the Lord rained down fire and brimstone, destroying the cities and burning the inhabitants to death. But the story doesn't end there. As they fled, Lot's wife disobeyed the angels and looked back at the cities and was transformed into a pillar of salt. Number 4. The Egyptian army drowns. Number 4 on our list details the fatal consequences of an error the Pharaoh of Egypt made. The Egyptians oppressed the Hebrews and kept them as slaves until the Pharaoh was finally convinced to let them go. The Israelites packed up and they started their journey across the desert. When the tribes reached the Red Sea, God had Moses stretch his hands out over the water, and a strong east wind sprang up and blew the sea back, so it formed a wall of water on either side and a dry path through the middle. All through the night, the Israelites crossed the seabed in safety, while the Spirit of God lit their way. Meanwhile, the Pharaoh had changed his mind about letting the Israelites leave and sent 600 of his strongest chariots after them. In a low-key move, God made the chariot wheels wobble and created confusion among the Egyptian soldiers. As a result, the chase was slowed and the Israelites were able to complete the crossing of the Red Sea unharmed. When the Egyptian army finally got to the middle of the Red Sea, again Moses stretched out his hand and closed the sea, drowning the Egyptian army, including their horses and their chariots. We've reached the top 3 of biblical punishments, and if you thought drowning an entire army was extreme, well, wait until you see what's next. These top 3 punishments are the most devastating, brutal, and world-changing events in the Bible. Number 3. The 10 Plagues of Egypt. Long before the Egyptian army chased the Israelites through the Red Sea, God sent 10 plagues to convince Pharaoh to release the enslaved Israelites. In between each plague, Moses and Aaron would go before Pharaoh and plead for release. But the Pharaoh was a tough audience. The plagues were: the Nile turned into a river of blood, the fish died, and the water wasn't fit to drink. In addition to the river, water reserves in the storehouses turned to blood, causing great thirst in the land. Frogs infested Egypt, including the royal residence of the Pharaoh. After 3 days, all the frogs died, and the Egyptians had to clean up the stinking carcasses. The 3rd plague was lice. After that came the plague of flies, a mass killing of Egyptian livestock, an outbreak of painful boils, and then a thunderstorm of hail and fire, which killed humans and even more livestock. Then the 8th plague was a swarm of locusts that devoured the crops, causing famine. For plague number 9, God enveloped the land of Egypt for 3 days in total darkness. The final plague was the worst. God sent an angel of death to kill the firstborn son of every living being in the land. God only spared the households that were marked with the blood of a lamb, leading to the festival of Passover. Number 2 on our list of God's most brutal punishments is reserved for that one time that God punished the entire world. Number 2, the Great Flood. Despite his teachings, God saw that humanity was pretty bad at keeping on the good side of morality. So he instructed Noah, a righteous man who had found favor with him, to build an ark. Despite being mocked and called a fool by his neighbors, Noah obeyed and constructed the ark. When the ark was finished, animals arrived 2 by 2 and were loaded aboard. Then the heavens opened. For 40 days and 40 nights, a deluge of water flooded the earth. Every living creature not on the ark perished, drowning in a catastrophic flood. It was a good time to be a fish. After the Great Flood, it took about 7 months for the waters to recede. It was a pretty dramatic way to teach humanity a lesson, but it worked. We've seen it all, from plagues that wiped out entire civilizations to personal punishments that drove men insane. But number 1 is the ultimate game changer, the punishment that changed the fate of humanity forever. Number 1. No more paradise. Many believe the most severe punishment in the Bible stems from the original sin. The Garden of Eden was a paradise where God created Adam and Eve, giving them free reign with one major rule: they were to not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. However, when a serpent tempted Eve, she ate the fruit and she shared it with Adam. Anyone who's been in the grocery store when they were handing out samples knows how hard it is to resist free food. But in that moment, Adam and Eve lost their innocence and gained knowledge of shame, evil, and guilt. They then realized their nakedness and they tried to hide from God. God was pretty angry and kicked them out of the garden. Adam and Eve's actions not only cost them the possibility of living in paradise forever, but also doomed all future generations to the same fate. And you thought the boomers were bad. As part of their punishment, humans were made mortal, would suffer pain in childbirth, and have to labor for survival. If not for Adam and Eve disobeying God, you might be lounging in paradise sipping fresh fruit juice and petting a panda right about now. Now go check out which mythology has the most powerful gods, or click this other video instead.